So when we were communicating a little bit about how to best spend this time, as amazing and wonderful as the work of the Obama Foundation is, kind of our plan is to actually focus it more on kind of David's lessons of leadership. So while the Obama Foundation is doing incredible things, personally, I also want to hear about your story and your journey and how this area of compassion and wise leadership kind of became an interest of yours and become a practice of yours. And I also know that you're somebody who's kind of you've been able to see settings and environments, particularly being in the White House for so long, and how leaders interact that most of us will never get a chance to witness. And I would love for us, personally, I'm selfishly wanting to learn, what are your leadership lessons from being able to see people and heads of nations and other people be able to navigate that path? So my first question, though, is to start off with, was there something in your life that ignited this interest to be a person or be a leader that had these elements of compassion and wisdom and mindfulness as a component to that? Or was this kind of inherent in you when you were growing up? You're like, oh, this is always something I'm drawn to. Or was there a experience, an event, a moment where that ignited in you?
Soren, first of all, thank you for doing what you do. It takes a lot to bring an event like this together, and to do it as consistently well as you do is a testament to you and your team, so thank you for that. To all of you, my parents are two Portuguese immigrants who came to the United States in the late 1960s. And one of my first memories as a child was when my father came to my babysitter's house, an aunt, and said that my mom had been in a terrible accident at work. And she was working in a silver factory and making forks and spoons and knives. And for some reason, someone had cut a corner on the maintenance of the machine. The machine malfunctioned. And then immediately she lost fingers on her hand. Wow. This 23-year-old woman doesn't speak a word of English, left everything behind, and for an immigrant with, although she is brilliant and smart, but very little, if any, formal education, all you have are your hands. And so in a blink of an eye, that hope, that aspiration, that dream that they had was essentially in balance. And I remember vividly that months and years passed, and neighbors and friends and coworkers, and it was as if an entire little community, the Portuguese village as we called it, saw that one of theirs was wounded, and they lifted her up. Wow. And fast forward 30 plus years, and their son, David, as my mom and dad call me, gets off the S2 bus and walks into the West Wing of the White House as an assistant to the President of the United States. And Soren, I repeated the same thing every day on the way in and at night on the way out. And the mantra was, remember who you are and what you represent. Because I wasn't there because I was the smartest. I wasn't there because I had worked the hardest. I wasn't there because God knows I wasn't the most connected. But that experience and the immigrant experience taught me something deeper that I needed to remind myself was, I was there because literally an entire community, at the moment my mom fell, lifted her up, and at moments when I needed to be lifted up, I was lifted up. And so I wasn't there as David Simas, assistant to the President of the United States of America. I was there in a lot of ways standing on the shoulders of people who had made me possible, and therefore I have had and will continue to have that responsibility to basically have the same type of shoulders for others.
Wow. Wow.
And she hates when I tell that story. Too bad.
And so that ignited something.
Yeah.
And then putting that into practice in your life, how does that work today? Is there daily reminders? Is it a continual mantra? How do you find yourself staying connected to that mission and that sense of a we space?
So without getting too much into our work, essentially the Obama Foundation has one focus. It's to inspire, empower, and connect people to change their world. So it's not issue specific, but it's about everybody understanding that they have agency, they have voice, they have power. They are a member of a community, and it's not just your rights, but you have responsibilities to the community. But if it ends there, then you are simply an individual, independent actor, and no one can do anything alone.
Yeah.
And so it's this transition from me, which is essential, to we. And so on a daily basis, I will see dozens and hundreds of stories of the young people that we're touching. And so even on the worst of days, you see the story. Yesterday, there was a young woman, south side of Chicago, 20 years of age, African American. 4 grandparents died from health issues. Wow. Because they did not have access to the basic wellness that frankly would have allowed them to live. So she has dedicated her life to, and she started an organization called Black and Well.
Black and white.
Black and Well.
Black and well.
And so she is essentially doing yoga and wellness and mindfulness in grammar schools throughout the south side of Chicago. She's a 20-year-old young woman. Right? You can't be inspired by that.
Yeah.
And so that for me is a wonderful constant reminder. But there's just one practice that I do. So I do my formal practice in the morning. And then at night I do a reflection on the day, which my wife sometimes refers to as my self-flagellation practice.
Not self-compassion?
No, I'm interested. I'm sitting in Jeff's chair. Which is, in some ways, what are the ways that I have not lived up to what are my values and ideals? And it isn't in a punishment way, but it's in this moment of reflection that says, look, I want to treat you with dignity.
Yeah.
Do I do it in every interaction? I don't. Yeah. Ego, pride, busyness, something comes up. I treat you with less than what I should. And so for me, that daily kind of anchoring to say, you know what, I can do better is an important part of that practice.
Wow, and to do it with, I imagine, some level of kindness and compassion, but also clearly seeing how you can improve. Right. That's a beautiful thing. So I'm wondering how you take on your work with, because you had told me this story that when President Obama had asked you to run his re-election campaign, you explained to him, I don't know how to run an election campaign. He said, you'll figure it out. And then as the administration was coming to a close, he sat you down and said, David, I want you to run our foundation. And you had also not run a foundation. I'm not trying to make you look bad. But you've taken on things that he saw in you, the ability to do something that maybe even you didn't see at that time. Yeah. And so I'm wondering, how did you take those responsibilities, which are huge, and take them on with both confidence but also humility?
So one minor important addendum is he asked me to oversee all of the polling and the focus group work on the re-elect. Jim Messina was our campaign manager. But I had never done anything like that before. And the thing that President Obama and good leaders and compassionate leaders do this is essentially he allowed me and other people like me to basically lift up from what is directly around them. Mm-hmm. That act of having people see their potential, but at the same time then say, you will be surrounded by people you can turn to. Don't ever feel that you have to carry this by yourself, because by definition, you can't. Right? And so it's this beautiful recognition that all of us, every single person in this room, I believe, can be thrust into an engagement or an opportunity that you have literally no background in. But if all of a sudden you approach it from a sense of compassion that says, I have people around me, or I have networks that I can tap in the act of basically being honest and saying, look, I don't have all the answers, and frankly, I shouldn't have all the answers. But we, together, can move something forward. It is the way that he views leadership. One thing that I'll never forget that he said to all of us on the senior team, young man, south side of Chicago, community organizer. He could have done anything.
This is President Obama.
Barack Obama. But instead he goes into organize in communities that had been ravaged by deindustrialization and the steel plants shutting down. In the first few months that he was doing the organizing, the person who had hired him said, look, I don't want you literally to do anything but listen. Meeting after meeting after meeting after meeting, do not tell people what you think, listen. He's like, really? I've got all these ideas and all this experience. He's like,
this is after his Harvard training, yeah. Okay.
Listen. And he says, now this is the President of the United States afterwards, like, every time I tried to go into a community and tell them what I thought they needed, I failed. The only time I ever succeeded is when I deeply listened. And there is an inherent beauty there that goes into who we are. Imagine the most well-intentioned, smartest, best-connected person coming to you and saying, here's what you need, right? The defense mechanism goes up right away. First of all, I don't know you. I don't trust you. I don't have any relationship with you. What are your motives? What do you intend? Versus a servant leadership dynamic that goes in and, first of all, acknowledges, not in an act of false humility, but in truth. I am here to learn as much as I can. And in learning, what you're doing isn't then pivoting to say, okay, I've now listened and here's what you need to do.
Yeah. I find that hard in relationships.
Yes.
Yes.
Right. But instead to engage in an act of leadership that says, look, I've been listening for month after month after month. And let me distill what I have heard, and please tell me if this is what you have said. And then the next step is the beautiful part. Essentially, now you don't say, okay, here's what I'm going to do. Now you say, all right, here's what you can do, and how can I be of most service to you in doing that?
Yeah.
It's an entirely different view of a view of leadership that is traditional and autocratic and top-down, is very independent.
Yeah.
I am the repository of wisdom and knowledge. Right? You're wrong.
Doesn't work in parenting either.
Right.
Yeah.
So that's
beautiful.
So just
That's beautiful.
a little experience.
I wonder, I think part of one of our challenges that we're facing as a culture today is, and I face this, is I look at some people and they just seem stupid and wrong.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, they just seem stupid and wrong. And I'm torn between, do I really try to understand them? Or do I just name what I see?
Yeah.
Like, wow, that is just a really stupid and wrong statement. And I'm wondering, how do you navigate that in your world where you're representing what's possibly the largest brand, if you will, or the people with almost the most influence, or some of the most influence in the world.
Yeah.
And you need to hold up a certain level of integrity. And we know that compassion is the thing that matters. And yet there are some people that seem to hold positions where it's so hard to hear, and it's so hard. And I'm wondering how you navigate that path yourself, and the pressure that must also be on you you're not only representing yourself, you're representing something that has quite a bit of leverage, and the wrong pull in the wrong way has repercussions that are significant.
Let me start there. I am mindful of, and I say this to members of the team, and there are a couple of members of the team here who are tired of having me say this, but when I go to work, I am who I am. But I have to do my work, the what I do and the how I do it, in a way that embodies the values and the ethic and the ethos of Barack and Michelle Obama. That is a responsibility that we all have and we take seriously. Because one of the things that I think that is true in politics, but it's also a function of human nature, that I have seen that there are two ways to build political power. And this is an oversimplification. You can do it by having people turn to each other or on each other. And each one of us, depending upon the prompt or the priming, can very easily turn to or turn on.
Wow.
And the understanding, the awareness of the choice that you make in those circumstances is very, very important. So that's in terms of an orientation. I'll tell you a story about Pete from Des Moines.
Okay.
It's a false name to protect the identity of the... There was one night before it was after the 2010 election where Republicans and the Tea Party insurgency wiped out Democrats in the House and almost took the Senate. And we in the White House, I was doing some political work, and we wanted to understand the voter who had voted for Barack Obama in 2008, and then in Iowa, where we were, had voted for Congressman Steve King, for example. So literally, how do you go from our perspective of hope and change to, in 2 short years, let's burn the house down? My words, not anybody else's. And so I went into that focus group, and I'm standing behind the two-way mirror, and I have my judgments.
They could be stupid and wrong.
And all of a sudden, and I am so certain of my truth, and they, if I could just explain, if I could just meet with every single person, and then if I could just talk to 70 million people, right? And so the moderator throughout this discussion literally said, how do you go from voting for Obama and then voting for a Tea Party member? And Pete said, I had to tell my son a couple of months ago that I could not send him to the college that he has always wanted to go to. He probably will get over it, but I'm not. My pension that I worked my entire life for, during this, what we just went through, probably got wiped out by about 30 or 40%. I have to work till I'm 70. I do construction. I can't work until I'm 70. I'm paying more for health care, and I'm getting less. Everything around me bears no relationship to what I remember. I am tired of putting my hopes and dreams and aspirations in some politician, and my life doesn't change. I am going to fire people until my life gets better. Don't judge me.
Wow.
How dare I go to that man? Well, let me explain. Because that conversation that he had with his son, that opening up of the letter, that all of a sudden, these aren't just numbers describing my pension in his mind. What do I need to do for the next 20 or 30 years? And God knows what happened if my health insurance, I can't do it. What are you going to do about it? Right. Don't tell me about your ideology.
Right.
See me. Right?
Yeah.
And that discussion in discussions like that, night after night after night after night after night after night, provided a sense of clarity that even after the election in 2016, same dynamic. We talked to people who voted for Barack Obama twice, approved of the job he was doing on Election Day in November of 2016, and then voted for President Trump. We wanted to understand, although I had an inkling, let's talk about this. And essentially, what I heard essentially was the following. A dislike for both candidates. The insider I dislike and the outsider I dislike. Well, what about these policies? Really? You think I'm going to believe a 30-second ad? You think I'm really going to believe a newspaper when I know that they are tied with the Republicans and another one is tied in with the Democrats? You really think I'm going to believe if I go to this website that I know is only the Democrats and this one that's only the Republicans? Where do I turn to discern whether or not this attack is true? A pox on both of them. And then when the moderator said, what's the similarity between Barack Obama and Donald Trump? And it was easy. It was easy in a way where, again, you don't want to judge. Like, what is the spoken truth here, the experienced truth? Both outsiders. What does that represent? What does that say? What does that mean, right? Both seen as fairly pragmatic. The third was the most important, which echoed back to Pete from Des Moines. Hope and change was the other side of the coin of drain the swamp. Expressing the same sentiment, but with very different emotions. Right? And so when you then go, no matter which side of the political spectrum you're on, one way that you don't persuade is by calling someone a name.
Yeah.
Right? Because it hardens people into whatever their prior beliefs are in a way that doesn't do the work. What does the work is when you sit with someone that you profoundly and fundamentally disagree with, if you begin that discussion and you define your relationship simply based upon that, that's all you're going to be. If I know that Pete, like me, is a dad, Pete, like me, is married, Pete, like me, has hopes and dreams, thinks about them a little bit differently, he and I have connections that then can become the basis for the beautiful growth from empathy to compassion and ultimately trust and cooperation, which at the end of the day is the only way democracies work. And so, Soren, forgive me for a very
That's good.
long-winded answer, but I feel pretty strongly about it.
Yeah. And even when you're doing everything to get them that, like even when you feel like I'm the one who's working my butt off to get you that, I still understand your perspective that there's pain there and you're wanting to alleviate that pain.
That's right.
I might not agree with how you alleviate that pain, but I can't argue with the pain.
Yes.
And that I feel like is, that's such a beautiful lesson. And I wondered how that, I would just imagine you've had so many successes, and yet there's also these lows of like, oh, we missed something, or we didn't understand something, or could we have done it better? And I'm wondering how you navigate that, because I feel like a lot of, and certainly in the political world, there's winners and losers pretty easily.
Every day.
Every day, there's winners and losers. And how do you stay, is it maybe it's the people that you're working with that keeps you hopeful, or do you stay hopeful? Or
yes, the darkest moment, the worst moment was when those 20 children were slaughtered in a classroom in Connecticut. The President and Mrs. Obama went to Newtown, and the families were put into 6 or 7 different classrooms. Be mindful that their kids had just been killed 2 days before, 6-year-olds. And in each one of those classrooms, the parents are there grieving, and they have their other children with them. Barack and Michelle Obama, for hours, the very act of just grieving with them and hugging them, getting down to eye level, the way the two of them do so beautifully because they are parents with a sibling of a child who just, right? There are the reason that something like that doesn't take away all of my hope. You see what happened with the Parkland kids.
Yeah.
Right? And the difference between the 6-year-olds and the 16 and 17 and 18-year-old kids are that those 16 and 17 and 18-year-old kids could stand in front of a camera. And they could provide testimony to what they saw. I was on a stage at Wisdom 2.0 with Fred Gutenberg. Fred was describing how he saw a video. He saw a video that was on closed caption in the school where he saw the moment his daughter was killed. And he said, the thing that I will never undo is that I can never go back to that morning and tell my daughter I love her. I don't know if I did. Fred has turned this into a mission to make sure that he and others like him can put an end to the scourge. That makes me hopeful. That in the most unspeakable of circumstances, right?
Yeah.
And that none of us there but for the grace of God. That makes me hopeful. There is something there which, as Jeff was saying, compassion is empathy plus action.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
And every single day, he and others like him, and it's just not around gun violence, but it's around so many issues where we feel pain. And one of the beautiful parts of the human condition is once you feel the pain and you recognize the pain, then you turn it into something good.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
There is a hopefulness there.
Yeah.
But you hope for the best, but you work for it.
Yeah.
And that's where the responsibility of community comes in. The other thing that was beautiful, so the way the White House is structured, it's called the Executive Office of the President. And look, it was surreal. And I had like imposter syndrome hard every day.
They're going to find you out.
Yes, I'm like, how do they get through this badge word? It's crazy. One of the things President Obama insisted, he would get 10 letters a day that he would read out of tens of thousands that were written. And all of the members of the senior team, assistants to the president, and I had the honor of being one, in our briefing book, right at the top, were the 10 letters.
Wow. Randomly chosen?
Randomly chosen by our correspondence team. Letters that said good things about us, letters that said horrible things about us. Some of the good things were true. Some of the horrible things, not out of bad intention, but unintended consequences were true. The beauty and the humility of that, but also think about the mom who's living in a car in Idaho with her 3 kids in a station wagon. Both the desperation and the hope of that moment of writing a letter to the President of the United States with no expectation. Right? And on this one day, sitting at the Oval Office at the Resolute desk, the President of the United States opens up his briefing book and reads a letter from a mom in Idaho and then calls the secretary of whatever and says, let's do something. What can we do to help? Right? There are these moments, and it's not Democrat, it's not Republican, it's the George W. Bush administration, our best friends, were people who became colleagues in some ways and peers. Why? Because they knew that when we took the oath, in the finest moment, it wasn't that I didn't look at the letter to see is she a registered Democrat.
Right.
It was. That's why I'm hopeful.
And how do you see? Because we look at the world today, and there's a lot of challenges. There's climate change. There's income disparity. There's poverty. There's so many different kind of things to tackle. And I think a lot of people, it's easy to feel overwhelmed and powerless and feel like, here's the problem. The problem is that there's wealthy people who just have way, way too much money and they're not sharing it. The problem is these corporations and they're just polluting. The problem is we all have the problem is, whatever the problem is, it's definitely not me, right? I mean, I don't know what the problem is, but it's not me. There's these actors, and I feel like there's so much power that drives, and
Yes.
political forces, like look at the last election, huge motivator. There is this entity, immigrant, whoever it is, right? There's somebody that we identify, and I think, how do we begin to shift this notion that this is while there are actors that are
Yes.
creating havoc, the way of responding, can there be enough motivation towards a sense of we than there is a sense of other?
So this is,
Move there.
theory, right? But one notion right now is if we view our civic engagement as simply a function of whether or not we vote or not, that is insufficient.
Yeah.
It's the minimum. Because even if you just do that, essentially the act of voting is a wonderful act of agency conference on another individual, and you basically, you do your job. And I will sit back and I will judge whether or not you're doing a good job or not, and right? Fine. What's your job?
Yeah.
Right? When you see a problem in your community, it's fine to call the mayor, it's fine to call the state senator. Good. What are you going to do about it?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
We work with our young leaders around essentially 4 basic elements: personal narrative, issue mapping, power mapping, asset inventory. This is the toolkit of every citizen. And citizenship isn't in the paper. It is the understanding that you are part of a community. It isn't independence, which in some ways is a consumptive form of what I am entitled to as a member of a community. Responsibility is a generative form of what we do together. So when you begin with personal narrative, what are you doing? You are teaching people, citizens, to say, don't just give people your resume, give them a story of who you are and why you care about what you care about. Open yourself up. There's a vulnerability, but an inherent strength in doing that. When you do that, no matter who you're talking to, we will find connections with one another. Community begins to build. Issue mapping. What is that thing, Soren, that you care so much about, you would pay to do rather than be paid to do it? I care deeply about the park down the street. Why? Because my little girl is going to play there. It's filthy, it's dirty. I'm going to call the alderman. Fine. What am I going to do? Power mapping. As I begin to think about building a plan around the park, is the alderman or alderwoman sufficient? No. Who runs the Chicago Park District? When they think about the decision, about the plan I'm going to bring them, how are they going to think about it? Who are they going to turn to? What is their incentive system? Legal, regulatory, normative, reputational, electoral. Map it. That is a priority of citizenship. It isn't just knowing the branches of government, but it's understanding how the levers of how we interact with each other operate. And finally, asset inventory, which is a recognition that I may have a great idea. Maybe I will just grab my Ziploc bag and pick up all the stuff at the park and throw it away. That's a good start. But imagine if I've just did the power map and I say, well, Soren, you're good at X, I'm good at Y, all you are good at a whole bunch of other stuff. Let's build a coalition of people intended to fix what we believe needs to be fixed. Here's the beauty of that. When we're doing that, there is not a liberal or a conservative, there's not a Democrat, there's not a Republican in terms of the work. We still have that piece of our identity, but all of a sudden, our discussions aren't just about what I hate about this or that, but it's about what we share in common. Discourse, relationship, collaboration as a lifeblood of what it means to be in community. And in some ways, technology gets a beating because our phones are an efficient means to atomize us. And even though we're more connected than ever, we lack fundamental connection with each other, right? But at the same time, the technology enables us in things like what I just described to do it at an efficiency at a scale so that it isn't just this little neighborhood group on the south side of Chicago. I now can be connected with other organizations that are sharing the same value and ethos in a way where a bottom-up active citizenship and civic engagement rooted in compassion is real and true. That's
the vision.
That's the North Star.
Yeah, love it. Love it. Thank you. Thank you. So we have some time for questions. Thank you, David. Long theoretical exposés are probably not the best. Short, to the point questions are lovely, and then we can get to as many as possible. So out of compassion for everybody else who might have a question, much appreciated. And if you want to say your name and where you're from, it might just help us connect with.
My name is Abi. I work for LinkedIn as an engineer. And my question is is kind of applicable to me and a lot of people, which is I'm not in a position of authority, but I recognize times when people are not being empathetic, and I notice the problems that people around them have. So how can I influence without authority, right? We've been talking about compassion. Oh, I'm the CEO, so I can do a lot. I'm not the CEO, right? How can I do a lot? That's basically my question.
So the story that Jeff told about when he was at Yahoo, as a mid-level member of a team who saw the way his manager was behaving and treating a colleague and presented in a way that essentially was based upon a level of trust that then actually created a rippling effect, is the perfect example of that. And the only other thing that I think is important, and it's hard to do, it is easy to go to someone when you see something you want to change and to say, you did X, Y, and Z. I can assure you that even if you have a good relationship, that formulation immediately puts us on the defensive. And usually then people will engage in a level of motivated reasoning that even if they agree they did something, will contextualize it in a way that excuses the behavior. That's who we are. If you go, here is how I felt based upon what I saw. No one can deny your truth. And it opens up this willingness, and generally, if you say, look, I was hurt by this, or I felt this, or help me understand, right? It is an entirely different, non-aggressive, non-confrontational openness that then even maximizes the power that you have. And so it's not just the ability to do it, but then to do it in a way that recognizes essentially how people can be triggered, if that makes sense. Good. Thank you for your question.
And I just have to add, in intimate relationships, whenever I have done one versus the other, world of difference. Yeah. Honey, you should do, doesn't work so well.
No.
My heart aches when I see it.
Yeah.
I'm learning.
As long as it's true.
As long as it's true,
right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes my wife will say, well, that's just because you have heartburn.
Which can be true. Yeah.
Hi, my name's Edward. I'm from Santa Cruz. I teach open-hearted movement and meditation. Do you think it's possible for a culture of unconditional compassion to be incorporated into our White House and our government and our nation? Is that something that can be successfully run a company or a country with that as an underlying philosophy?
So I do. Now, here's why I believe that, but I'll also say what the inhibiting factors are. Actually, let me begin with the inhibiting factors, because they're real. And I have been a part of that as a political actor on campaigns. The dynamic of I win, you lose, I need to get to 50 plus 1, in the understanding that usually you can persuade someone not in an aspirational way, but by looking at the 5 component parts of narrative architecture, which is essentially, at the end of the day, all of a campaign is. It's a story. What is the threat? Who is the victim? Who's the villain? You're the hero. What is the resolution? The resolution is the 2-point plan or the 3-point plan. But before you get there, there is a determination of threat, quote unquote, issue, and victim. And then who is the villain who has caused this? A lot of times in campaigns, on the progressive side, you will see an ad, and you've all seen them. So-and-so corporation has shipped 1,000 jobs overseas. Millionaires and billionaires who aren't paying their fair share of taxes. Right? There is and then a connection to the person who caused that. That is a villain dichotomy, a villain construct. Our conservative friends, illegal immigration, entitlement programs, mostly welfare, and a variety of others. And essentially, if you are the voter sitting at home, and I've seen this, you can see the first 30-second ad that's focused on the corporation shipping jobs overseas, and I'm like, damn right, tired of that. The next 30-second spot comes up, and it talks about an invasion of illegal immigrants that are driving up X, Y, and Z. I'm like, damn right, I'm tired of that too. And a lot of times a political campaign is about which one of those becomes more salient in a given moment. Right? And so if that is the way we're choosing, it results in an incentive system among the political class that to win, you need to go down that road, but then even more toxically, it creates an entire culture among the electorate that you're constantly being primed one way or another. Right? I don't have an answer for that structurally. And then when you add primaries, where essentially the dynamic on the right and the left is that the more you can tack to the right or to the left, that is, when only 8 or 9% of people participate in primaries, you're ceding the entire ground to folks who are most animated in the most ideological way, right? Mm-hmm. So that's a diagnosis of what I have seen and experienced. The presidency, in its finest moment, is the one office in the country where an individual who is the president of the United States is not just the head of the government and the head of state, but a role model, for good or for bad. President Reagan, when the space shuttle exploded, I remember. That is the presidency at the finest. It is the one person with everyone watching that can express who we are in the finest way. President Clinton, Oklahoma City. President George W. Bush, no matter what you believe about his policies or ideas, when he stood on top of the rubble at 9/11, that moment, saying we will rebuild, that's the presidency at its finest, right? And so how do we, as people, and it has to be bottom up because of the incentive systems that I talked about, and it's hard. How can, when we think about who we are electing, essentially factor in that piece? And so that is an unsatisfactory answer to a question that I spent a lot of time thinking about. But if there is one office in the country, besides the office of citizen, which, as Brandeis said, is the most important, that's the importance for me of the presidency as someone who has now been in that building about what it means. So thank you for your question, sir. I appreciate it.
One of the things I heard too is people. One of my teachers, there was this question of, can you be enlightened or are you enlightened? And the teacher responded, "There's enlightened moments." Whether there can be only enlightened moments, that's a whole other thing. But there can be enlightened moments. And so can we create a totally compassionate government or world?
During those a perfect example, going back to President Bush, in the wake of 9/11, he made the conscious decision and told his entire team, where people were primed to engage in the worst kind of virulent Islamophobia. At that moment, with 3,000 Americans dead, he brought in the Muslim community to the White House.
Yeah.
That's the presidency.
Yeah.
Because you can imagine a situation
Yeah.
very clearly the other way,
Yes.
where 90% of people in the rawness of tragedy
Yeah.
put aside the better angels of ourselves and are deeply wounded and grieving and at that moment of fear.
Yeah.
That for me is one of the finest moments of presidential leadership.
Yeah.
And I disagreed with just about everything else.
And we can do that in our own way, in our own houses and in our own companies. And I think that spoke to you. Like there is not at that level, but there are ways in which we can stand for that. Yeah. So next.
Lydia Khan. I'm American and British, and I've lived 20 years outside the US, and I've lived the last 8 without a home as I teach and work globally in order to raise awareness of homelessness. I'm ready to come back to the US and serve. And I'd like to know what the Obama Foundation is doing around homelessness, and I'd like to help.
Okay. Well, thank you. So we, as I said earlier, we focus on the people who do the work. And so imagine we had in Hartford, Connecticut, a group called the Community Leadership Corps. 113 18 to 25-year-olds for a 6-month civic leadership training. They show up filled with desire and passion in the thing that they care about the most. Perhaps a couple of them care deeply about homelessness. Imagine in 10 years, we, the Obama Foundation, in partnership with thousands of other organizations throughout the country, have replicated Hartford in hundreds of places, not just in the United States, but globally. So now there is a network of not 2 or 3 kids in Hartford who care about homelessness, but 10,000 people who are then part of a directory. And when you're on the directory, here's what you immediately have access to. The other 9,999 who are doing work on homelessness, the other 200 organizations who are part of the network. Because one of the things on any social issue that we see, especially at a local level, nonprofits and civic organizations focus like a laser beam on the problem in front of them, and it's rarely holistic, and it's rarely informed by the learnings and the successes and failures of others who have done the same work, never mind in the same city. Yes. So our bet, President Obama and Mrs. Obama's bet is, look, if we literally create the largest network of global and impactful change makers ever assembled on the planet and connect them to one another, unified by shared core values that we believe in about turning to each other rather than on each other, that's where you, in a few years, then care deeply about homelessness wherever you live, and you're part of the network, and you will instantaneously see, well, here are 3 organizations who are doing good work, and just as importantly, here are 4 young people who care so much about this, who want to benefit from what you have learned in a way that you pay it forward with their responsibility to do the same way. That's the approach, right? And it's informed by their experience, which is at the end of the day, no matter the way a country is organized, if people believe they no longer have a stake and they cede it, community dies. If you begin in that generative way, from the bottom up, community flourishes. And so soon, in a couple of years, you'll have your username and your password. And I can't wait for you to begin the work. Thank you.
Now I have to ask you, when you say you'll have your username and your password, you mean you're building a system, or are you just making?
We are building a system.
Got it. Okay. Got it. Do you have time for one more?
I do.
We'll go a little over. All right. One more question. Monique. All right.
Hi, thank you so much for your humanity. I'm Regina, and I have the privilege of writing what I like to think of as love notes to Google's leaders every 2 weeks. And but I don't look like a lot of the clients that I serve, and meaning that a lot of them are men and a lot of them are white men. So if you could look every human being in the world in the eye, specifically men like yourself, what would you say to them, or what would you do?
So repeat, if I could look to...
If you could look, just broadly speaking, if you could look every human in the eye,
Yeah.
what would you say to them, or what would you do? And specifically men, but it doesn't have to be.
So...
If you had one message,
Yeah.
or one.
Yeah.
So generally,
question.
generally for me, the thing that just animates my work and the work, I think, of all my colleagues is that belief that you have a voice and you have power. And you have a responsibility to use it to bring people together and not to tear them apart. That's your job. And that message applies with importance across different dynamics. When we think about questions of equity, the questions of equity for our programming on the south side of Chicago are fundamentally different than when we did our training in Johannesburg. And they are fundamentally different than what we will see in Kuala Lumpur, or that we saw in Berlin, or in Amsterdam, or in Oakland, or in other places in the country. And so a recognition of power dynamics is critical and key. The recognition that they're not uniform and they have different variations is critical and key. In one way that we believe you can really engage in there is around this kind of radical act of seeing each other. So one of the exercises we do, and we learned this from a group called Narrative 4. And I urge everybody to do this at some point in a group. So Regina, you and I would sit knee to knee. I would tell you my story of why. Why it is probably my mother's story. You would tell me yours. I would then stand up in front of this room and say, my name is Regina, and I would deliver your story in the first person. Mm-hmm. When you do that, all of the different aspects of identity that are visually apparent completely wash away. The last time I did this was with a young woman from Utah. Had just come out to her grandparents as a lesbian. Grandfather is in the Mormon faith a bishop. And they're in their 70s. And as she's telling me this, she says, my grandfather hugged me deeply and said, I'm going to hell. And my grandmother was crying and basically said, I can't have a relationship with you. I'm sorry. So I stand up. I say, my name is, I'll make it up the name, my name is Lauren. And as soon as I said, and then I went to my grandfather and my grandmother, I started to weep. I wept for her. I wept imagining my Portuguese grandparents, vovô and vovó. I closed my eyes and I was trying to imagine my vovô saying that to me. And even now thinking about that, it's like I'm feeling it right here, right? And so this notion of you having voice, you having power, you having a responsibility is the me. But then that transference to we that occurs that I wish we could scale,
We're trying.
you know, in a way. And so that's more than a sentence, but essentially that's
Perfect.
good. Thank you. I appreciate it.